Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we are focusing in on livestock forage production, the challenges and the options that are available in the short term, but also what can be done to build in some resilience in the longer term for the livestock enterprise. And joining me today to discuss and share their expertise are Ben Lowe, Agrii's National Forage Product Manager, and Amy Hardwick, Agrii's Sustainability and Environmental Services Manager. Let's start off by just reflecting on where we are right now as we drive around, Ben and Amy, and looking at the countryside. You know, Ben, how are grassland farmers and farms looking right now?
Well, I think, Tony, after such a challenging year last year, with it being a very dull, grey, wet year, incredibly wet winter, who would have then thought we could be just as equally challenging for this year, but for all the different reasons in terms of actually a lack of moisture. If we look back to the beginning of the year, we had a very good spring, very favourable spring after such a long, wet winter, but it still remained cool though. Remember those lovely dry, warm days, but actually really cold nights that actually hampered early forage production and growth, and also establishment of spring sown crops quite significantly. And then ever since then, we have had this incredibly reduced level of rainfall throughout large parts of the UK. Not for everywhere, but for large parts of England and certain parts of Wales in particular, that has really staggered overall production from there for the rest of the season. And we are getting quite concerning now in terms of, just where we are up to in terms of forage production for our farmers.
Thanks, Ben. And so what I'm hearing is that there could be a shortage of forage for livestock enterprises going into this winter. Amy, there's also been challenges because of the summer weather for arable farmers as well, hasn't there?
Yeah, and I hate to be the person that's doom and gloom in these circumstances, but it really has been a challenging year for all farmers out there, not just for weather, like how Ben said. We're seeing very mixed yields currently coming off the combine in Arable, but in the sector I particularly work in, which is the environmental sector, we've obviously seen drastic changes there too, with the overnight closure of the SFI scheme and subsidies, grant schemes as well, becoming more and more competitive for people to try and get into. It's really becoming more unpredictable and more challenging for farmers to predict what their financial income is going to be for that year, predict what their costs are going to be, and how do we actually get around that. And my main point really to farmers, I know it's a lot of challenges, but with challenges come new opportunities, and new opportunities to look at ways of doing things slightly differently. I think we've got caught in that cycle for many years now of thinking, well, hopefully next year will be a bit better than the last 2 years. But we are seeing this happen more and more regularly. So instead of a 1 in 20 scenario where we get a really bad weather year, we're now getting them much more frequently. So perhaps 1 in 5, or actually over the last 5 years, it's been perhaps 2 in 5. So they are coming much more frequently. So for our industry, it's thinking, how do we actually adapt our business for that becoming the norm in the future? It's looking at ways of improving your business resilience economically, so diversifying your income so you're not solely reliant on that crop and the weather that's dictating that crop performance, but also environmentally, and thinking about how you can build resilience into the environment that you're working in over a long period of time.
Yeah, very good points there, Amy, indeed. So let's start by going through some of those opportunities and those options. And Ben, maybe you can start us off there.
Amy makes some really good points there, Tony, in terms of starting to stitch in more resilience to what we already have. It can sometimes be a bit of a tricky one for me that we want to and we need to look at these other elements of what we can stitch in, but actually always, of course, hope that we don't have to pull on them. But then they are there if we do need them. What has been standout this year so far, they've not been the silver bullet, and they haven't necessarily, carried everything else in terms of responsibility and maintained overall production. But first and foremost is actually just how newer reseeds have actually performed better than old existing grass. So, newer reseeds that have more life about them, a much better rooting structure, tend to be a lot more resilient to the likes of extreme periods of drought in particular. We can then actually start within those mixtures, those new reseeding plans, look at a variety and a species level that give us more resilience from rooting structure, maybe the likes of legumes in there, red clovers, white clovers, maybe with that extra rooting system and drought capacity within the dry periods. But of course, they're fixing nitrogen as they go, and they're producing extra protein within forages. So there's other beneficial elements outside of the environmental impacts that they may have to shoulder as well. But also outside of that, it's again going back to Amy's point of view in terms of where we're site specific with these crops from our soil point of view. What is it that our soils are telling us that they do and don't adapt with and actually work with throughout that year. So from that point of view, it's all about just starting to stitch in the resilience of what we have, never mind actually then looking outside the box at the other solutions that we can possibly bring that haven't yet actually even been discussed or possibly thought about on farm.
I know before we came on air, you talked about some of the mixtures that you've got, and you talked, and you always do, Ben, about passionately about forage rye. Talk us through that a bit more. I can see you smiling there. It's your favourite, I think.
It is. I mean, obviously we've discussed hybrid rye in the past, but actually forage rye for me is been a bit of a labour of love over the last few years, because I could see that regardless of the situations that create the demand for these and the real reliance on these sorts of types of crops, actually there's a big opportunity here for a lot of growers, and the likes of forage rye is a key one to that. In particular, to follow the likes of an early maize harvest. If we think about a maize crop being established April to May time, harvested hopefully September, October, there's potentially 5 to 6 months of a year there where that ground is not really either keeping alive or actually producing for farmers. So what are the options that we could fit into that gap? And for me, the first and foremost and most reliable is actually the likes of forage rye in particular. So really simple to establish. So we're looking to harvest our maize in good order and then basically just direct drill forage rye straight into the maize stubbles post harvest. The beauty with forage rye is actually it doesn't really have much of a dormancy over the winter, so it just continues to grow as soon as it's been drilled.
Yeah, and talking of maize, are you expecting the harvest to be earlier this year because of this dry spell? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that is one thing that we can all agree on, is that regardless of the progress of maize crops and how good they are and how well they've established, we're looking like we're going to have an early harvest from the conditions that we've had, not only from the weather, but also, again, going back to the flip coin in terms of how wet we've been for the last 2 years, majority of the UK market has actually moved with variety selection and actually reach for ultra early harvesting varieties. So we tie that in now with a very dry year and the ultra early harvest capabilities of majority of the varieties that are being grown. And this provides a really, really key opportunity in a year like this now to establish something like a crop of forage rye, or maybe even an Italian mixture for some, if they prefer to go down that route, get those dividends that they've put into their variety selection from the current situation that we have in front of us now.
And Ben, if I was a farmer, one of the questions I'm sure I would ask is, well, how do I make the right decision in terms of what to put in the ground? Any advice?
Yeah, I mean, the return on investment for these sorts of types of crops is critical, and it's also the return on engagement as well for me, Tony. So if we look at the likes of the three options that are normally chosen for following our maize crops, producing forage over the winter months for the following year, you would have Westerwolds, Italians, and forage rye. For me, Westerwolds, for all the right reasons, are regularly selected. They are the cheaper option out of the three, and we know that Westerwolds can produce significant volumes of forage in the right conditions. Now, I would argue that actually establishing Westerwolds, especially after maize going into a UK winter, isn't those right conditions. Therefore, they aren't really, because they're so extreme, they're not really winter hardy, and they're actually quite frail in their extremity. Because of that, we see that farmers do reach outside the box. They do decide to establish something following their maize. They'll put some Westerwolds in, maybe, and they don't survive. They don't fulfill the requirement. And therefore a farmer gets dismayed and decides actually establishing something after my maize doesn't work for me, and unfortunately possibly never goes back to it again. The likes with the Italians, for example, they are a lot more winter hardy. They require a minimum soil temperature of 4 degrees and above to actively grow, so they will grow. But also it stitches in extra possibility for that Italian as well, because they will last longer. So if a plan changes and actually we decide we're going to keep that down to grass, they will be there for longer.
Looking for the latest maize advice? Download our up-to-date Agrii maize brochure at agrii.co.uk/our-services/tools-resources/documents. Packed with agronomy insight, variety info and tailored recommendations. Ben, you mentioned the different options. Is there seed available? That's the question farmers will ask.
In a year like this, it is becoming quite paramount in terms of securing seed early is key, because of course we've got a lot of demand on these sorts of types of products. But in any year, forage rye is a crop in particular that is growing and growing in popularity. And around about 2 or 3 years ago, started actually producing our own forage rye seed to try and ensure that we can cater for many more UK farmers getting involved with the likes of forage rye over the winter to secure their seed.
Yeah, good news. Amy, we talk about this word resilience so much these days, don't we? I think it features on every single podcast, but can we just focus on that for a minute or two? You know, what actually do we mean by resilience?
Yeah, resilience, it's the latest buzzword. It's probably on par with sustainability now out there. It's used that often.
But it is critically important, isn't it? And that's why we're focusing in on that word.
Absolutely, it really, really is. And you've got probably two types of resilience, but they're both very much interlinked. So you've got environmental and economic. But I cannot stress enough that economic resilience is so hung on how environmentally resilient you are as a business as well. So it could be the difference of whether you get a crop in the ground or not, or whether you have enough forage for that winter for the crop. If you don't have good, well-structured soils and good organic matter, then you might not be able to travel on that field early enough to get that crop in the ground that you need for that season. I mean, look at last year as an example. So the two really, really do come hand in hand. But what do we actually mean by it? How do you build resilience into a system? If we think particularly about forage production and maize, perhaps in an environmental situation, it's really about making sure that you have got soil covered over the winter periods. Rotations, so making sure you're diversifying your rotations, not just for the diversity in the soil, but also to diversify your income opportunities. If you're doing the same cropping year in, year out, then you're reliant on certain markets. So actually maybe thinking about putting a grass lay in your rotation somewhere might be, or a temporary grass lay might be really helpful there. And then on top of that, if you really are struggling about how do you boost resilience, or you've done as much as you can on the farm environmentally, you've done all the right things, you've undersown your maize, you've put cover crops in, you've added organic matter to the system, and it still isn't working, then you might actually have to start looking at, well, is it worth farming that piece of land? And that's a tough decision to make, because some people have farmed that for so many years and generations of farms, but you do have to make that decision sometimes. It might not be productive, or it might not be profitable to do. So looking at other alternative income streams for that part of the land or that field. And there is opportunities in forage and grassland farms in particular for biodiversity schemes at the moment. Now, this is a private sector funding. It's not necessarily to do with the government schemes like SFI we have available. But in England, we do have biodiversity net gain available to farmers. It's not for everybody, but if you've got, say, a small paddock near the house that isn't really producing much each year, and you're thinking, actually, where can I earn money elsewhere for that field? Biodiversity net gain might be a nice option. The big challenge with it is it's a 30-year scheme, which instantly puts quite a lot of people off. But what happens in that 30 years is essentially you have somebody in that pays you rent for that field to help bring it from what was a productive or intensively grazed grass lay, and bringing up the species diversity in that mix so that it's improving biodiversity on the farm. And you get paid rent for that. So you get paid rental every year for that field over the 30 years. And then you also get somebody to come in and manage that field for you as well. So there is that opportunity available. Now, that's only one opportunity. There's plenty of others out there too, in thinking about how you can diversify your income on the farm. But it is certainly worth starting to look at those. I mentioned earlier about we can't be stuck in this cycle of thinking, hopefully next year will be better and hopefully next year will be better, because it currently isn't happening. So you do have to look at what options are available to you and which one best fits your business and where you could put that in place, essentially.
Amy, you talked there about resilience, building in that resilience for the farm business. Ben, how important is that when it comes to this issue of forage supply?
I think it's becoming more and more critical actually now, Tony, as we go forward and we go through more of these cycles of this variable weather. We need to start thinking about producing forage for those pinch points, and the windows that we have available to us over the autumn, over the winter, like I say, are often overlooked. We focus significantly between the months of April and probably September for the majority of our forage production window, but actually what can we do outside of that over the winter to mitigate or at least extend the forage that we do produce maybe. So it is looking at the likes of establishing a crop after your maize to take off at the end of April. As I said to a lot of growers this year, we already had hot and dry conditions at the beginning of May this year. And even though the forage dry yields that we did get after the winter weren't overly vintage necessarily, they would become very, very valuable come July, August. Well, guess what? They've become very valuable this July and August. Possibly even extending in terms of utilising, as Amy said, forage within arable rotations. You may be next door to a livestock farmer next door to an arable unit. Can you establish a forage brassica mix maybe in their winter cereal stubbles now to give you extended grazing over the winter, to give them a bit of a break and a bit of a difference within their rotation maybe. So looking at these other options to extend that, never mind also, of course, maximising and making sure that we improve our relatively static forage options, mainly around grass, to make sure that they are as resilient as possible.
So as we come towards the end of this podcast, and as we always do, I'd like to ask for a top tip that you would like to offer up to those who are listening today that could be really helpful for their farm business. Ben?
The last thing we can afford to do is effectively do nothing, Tony. If we are beginning of August now, we have around about a 12-week window to try and start turning some of this around. We have the month of August effectively to start getting something drilled and a plan put in place to have and mitigate some of that risk going forward. Look, we've discussed the options that we've had today, but even just something as simple as just hoping that the grass will come green again. The problem is that all grass will always turn green again, but what will actually turn green? And we see that in years like this, when you have had significant drought, you'll get a lot of ingress of likes of grass weeds and things like that, which will turn a field green. But the last thing we need to do is go into next year on the back foot from the remnants from this year. I appreciate that looking to potentially establish the likes of new lays, overseeding, could well be seen as we've got to start again, but in many cases it's been that dry. We're already at ground zero with a lot of these grass lays in particular. So looking at the options that we have and taking action is going to be the key point in terms of making those plans to mitigate the shortfalls that we may have over the winter.
Yeah, good points, Ben. Thank you. Amy, what would be your thoughts on building this resilience on farm?
My thoughts would be to get used to the fact that we're having these challenging weather years and they are becoming much more frequent. And instead of getting stuck in the rut of thinking, hopefully next year will be better, hopefully we'll have some better weather next year, actually use it as an opportunity to broaden your horizons and think outside the box and look at different opportunities within the industry for your land, for what you can do to your crop to help make it healthier at the end of the year, but also long term, what you can do to your soil structure, the rest of your business to help make that more resilient too.
Thank you, Ben and Amy, for your invaluable thoughts on forage production. Do stay tuned here on Tramlines, recent episodes live from Groundswell, AgriFocus and a blackcurrant farm at harvest, as well as many more. If you have any questions for our experts that you would like answered, email them in to info@agrii.co.uk. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. See you next time.